A few years ago, my director of undergraduate studies came to me and said, Gulan, we have a problem with your lectures. And I said, okay, what's that? Well, you know, the students have stopped coming, but I've solved the problem, he said. I've decided that from now on, your lectures will be mandatory. And the only thing you need to do in addition to what you already do is to hand around a notice of attendance and ask people to sign that. And then he looked a bit awkward. He looked at me and said, oh yeah, you're vice president for digitalization. Of course, you want the list of attendance to be digital. I'll see what I can do about that. And I sort of felt that, well, maybe it's not about mandatory participation that is this solution to this problem. So I asked him to have some time and go around and investigate what had happened. One of the things that happened was that I went to one of my students who early on asked that is it okay if I use my mobile phone and record your lecture? Because I have various disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia, and so forth, and I have problems keeping up with what is happening. So I went to this student and asked him, how do you perceive this? And he said, wow, it's fantastic. This is the first time I've been able to follow a lecture through and understand everything. I watch 1 minute of the lecture over and over again until I get it, and it's been amazing. And I said, yeah, great, but it doesn't really explain why students aren't coming to the lectures anymore. And then he said, well, by the way, I created a Facebook group and I shared your lecture among all other students. And I said, okay, fair enough. I went around and asked other students how they perceived this, and I got these amazing stories. A girl from Iran that said that she'd found software to subtitle my lecture in Persian, so they were sitting the entire family looking at my lectures on Friday night and discussing that. That was their Friday entertainment. Or the sleepy guy in the corner that I managed to grab that said, I think your recorded lectures are super because you speak so slowly, so I watch it afterwards in double speed. Thus I save half the time of lecturing. So what's my point of such a story? Well, it's a little bit pointing to who's in charge of our change at the university, who's in charge of the digitalization, who's driving it. Well, it's basically the students that are doing that thing, according to me. And the biggest threat towards digitalization is maybe us, the professors, and that is quite an interesting thing to keep you thinking about. I'm a professor in human-computer interaction, as Olga said in the introduction. I have always studied and worked on the digitalization of public authorities in various ways. And as being a human-computer interaction person, what I do is that I do field studies. I study how people interact with technology. I analyze this material. We work collaboratively to design new environments and prototype new environments and evaluate them in various different settings. It could be with AI, with mobile devices, with traditional laptops or walkable user interfaces or whatever it is. So that's basically what I do. When I do field studies, I always take pictures of what is happening, a lot of pictures. And the very first field study I did, I went back to the same workplace 20 years later to see what has happened. And basically, as you can see, there's not much development, unfortunately. Over the 20 years, there's two major things that have happened. The first of all, the screen, the display has become flat. And at that time in the 90s, they were complaining about sore eyes because the radiation from the display that make the eyes get warm and so forth. So that's one change, which is, of course, a great change. The other big change is that we got now more colors and sizes of Post-it notes. But still, the interfaces look basically the same, in a sense, even the same colors, a bit depressing. And this is not what I would call digitalization. This is what I would call computerization, where we bring in new technology and do not really think that the business that we're into will change a lot. When I got this task that Olga talked about to head the Commission for Digitalization back in 2012, we actually investigated this concept of digitalization to think about what does that actually mean. And I got this sort of scientific explanation of what it was. English is a rich language here, although Swedish is maybe a richer language when it comes to bureaucratic terms. In English, you distinguish between digitization and digitalization. And digitization, it's like when we make our forms available online, to print them, fill them in by hand, scan them and send them back, but without really changing the way we do things. So what I want to promote more is digitalization, which is the bigger process, the societal change that happens when we bring in new technology to facilitate things. And when I try to explain what this means, I have an example that I think shows some of my points of making this distinction, and that's looking into the music industry. Many would claim that it's organizations such as Spotify that has digitalized the music industry. But I would claim that with that definition, the change actually started 150 years ago, when we went from having a band, you could only see a concert live, to actually starting to record it, using technology to store things. And Edison, who was involved in the first inventions here, he invested most of his fortune into this wax roll company and almost went bankrupt because he didn't understand what the users actually needed. The users were more keen to buy this one, the flat vinyl LP or EP records that became the commercial success. The next step in the digitalization process that happened. When I was a kid, this was the technology that was there. And this was when politics started to interfere as well. We need to forbid these things because they take the market from those who are creating the music, they said. So good that the politicians didn't get that influence at that point. When I was old enough to get my own kids, this was the technology that people used. And little did we know that this would be a parenthesis in the history, more or less. But I have relatives who actually threw away all of their vinyls and buying CDs instead. And when I asked them why, they said, well, I really think I have such a beautiful music collection, so I want my kids to be able to inherit it from me in the future. And boy, that's not how things work today. This was my first portable thing that I actually could run with, containing 4 songs and a half-an-hour battery time. But I thought it was really amazing. And you know the rest. When it became smaller and smaller, moved into the telephone. Pirate Bay and others started with sharing things, and now we have these music sharing services, whose biggest invention is actually, I think, the business model, that you have gone from owning music to renting music. For me, this is the digitalization. It happens all the time. And you could see from various different sectors when you look into this that you have, like, Uber changed the taxi business, Airbnb, the biggest hotel that doesn't own any hotel rooms, or even the Google car down there, quite an old version now, but advertised with a blind person driving it, which creates completely new ways of interacting with technology. So my point here is defining digitalization as business development, defining it as an ongoing process. We shouldn't just launch a digitalization project that will last for 3 years and then we digitalize whatever we are doing. And also that has to be built on the clients or on the students in our case. 20 years of development, what would that look like in the school or in the classroom? But unfortunately, this is, to me, mostly what I've seen so far, that we've gone from the blackboard to PowerPoint. It's the digitization of teaching and learning, and not making use of all the wonderful knowledge that, for example, this conference intends to share in that sense. I would much rather like to see the digitalization of this happening. So when I explain what does it look like in the classroom to people outside of the university, I describe a classroom with fixed chairs where people, where a person is standing in the front and doing a one-way communication lecture, and people are sleeping in the room. There's a full room of people. People are chatting with each other. People are doing different things. And I'm actually explaining this picture. I'm actually explaining a business that hasn't developed in the last 800 years, more or less, in this. You even see the people sleeping down here, or is he using a mobile phone? It maybe even looks like that, or people talking to each other, or people doing other things. This is happening all the time. And that's not the way we should view things. And for sure, in this community, we know that various different new pedagogies that tries to flip this around, it's going to mean a tremendous change, which I think is an important one. And being in charge of the strategy with the university, we really need to support these ways of working. And working and moving sort of the traditional one-way communication knowledge from classroom knowledge to being at home knowledge in the future, rather, and meet at the university, use the campus for these more creative, evaluating, analyzing, applying knowledge type of things that we're doing. And I think that we have examples of this. I mean, I could take more or less any course at KTH, but I think one example that is kind of interesting that started even before the pandemic, where people that moved one of the final courses with only like 20, 30, 40 students a year, moved that digitally, advertised it on Facebook, made great efforts to produce the films with lectures in a great way. And they got from 40 to 7,000 students in a year's time on that. And also made the research group much more famous abroad by doing these kind of things. There's numerous examples of these types of things of doing it. And I think that that's an important, great change that needs to do with that. When it comes to politics, it's another issue that I think is important for teaching and learning, and that is the myth, I would say, that digitalization takes away jobs in the future. 5 or 6 years ago, it was very popular with these reports showing that 50% of the jobs would disappear within the next 20 years. It was presented as if this was groundbreaking new research in a sense, although it's mostly looked like this. And maybe the most cited or most famous one was Carl Benedict Frey at Oxford University talking about the jobs more prone to digitalization, like service, sales, office, administrative work, rather than these more less prone to changing due to digitalization: management, business, financial, computer engineering, science, education, and healthcare, and so forth. The interesting thing with these reports was that when presented to the ministers in charge, I got the feedback back saying, oh, you mean we should be against digitalization then? Because we've had this strategy that keeping or getting jobs is the most important thing to do whatsoever. No, not really, because there's new jobs created all the time. And these studies do not really look at all the new jobs that are there and the new jobs that are happening. And that we actually should pay close attention to also as universities, because are we educating for the right students, for the labor market, for the future? This is from a study looking into what happens when you have this hourglass economy that you're looking at, that some countries have adopted political strategies to move from reskilling, re-educating the people who loses jobs to be able to get new jobs higher up in the value chain, even possibly in this, earning more money, getting more skills to be able to do this. And just to pick out two examples here, Ireland with their strategy managed to get 8 out of 10 to move that way, while a country such as Portugal that didn't have a strategy for this, it turned out that most of the people that lost their job due to this digitalization effect actually then moved down the value chain and started with less skilled jobs in that sense. So here's the thing, we need to work then with how do we sort of become relevant, not only for the young students that we have, because universities, I would say mainly today, are mostly focused on the people between 19 and 25. That's where we have our target audience. While these people are people that have extensive business knowledge that we maybe should focus much more upon to be able to serve what politics needs in that sense. Another thing that I think is important to have a look at as well in this process is, if my slides will keep on moving forward now, is this one that comes from John Seeley Brown and his colleagues, that looking at the half-life of learned skills. Already back in 2011, he talked about it as within a period of 10 years, most of what you would have learned 5 years ago would be irrelevant. Because there's a best before date of skills that you learn. So why then do we put people at the universities for full-time educating them and then give it a full stop at the age of 25 or so and throw them out in industry, never ever to enter university anymore? John Seeley Brown recently talked about that this half-life is now down to 3 years instead. So that basically would mean that our 5-year programs would be far too long to be able to work with this. And basically, I think that here's a change we will see in the future. I don't believe that there's going to be such a fixed border between education and the working life afterwards. It's going to be much more mixed in the future. And we need to work with that strategically to be able to meet these demands from industry. The digital sector is, of course, one that is very critical in that sense. Here's from a study done a few years ago by the Swedish IT and Telecom authorities that is looking, it's now called Tech Sweden. It's looking at the job sectors with the highest negative unemployment rate. I mean, where you actually can't find the people to take the jobs. So 70,000 people were needed by 2022, they said, if things don't change, and things have not really changed in that sense. These industries still need a lot of people to be able to do their work when it comes to digital, when it comes to IT in that sense. And how do we meet that? Well, I borrowed this picture many years ago from Barroso that talked about this already back in 2015 and or 2013 actually. The right-hand side diagram, I think, is kind of interesting, looking upon how the vacancies in the digital sector is growing and will be continue to grow. Nowadays, they're talking about figures that makes this curve exponential, that the growth of jobs in the digital sector is enormous. But the interesting thing is the red line. That's what universities have done about it. We're not really educating to meet the demands on the market that is out there. And this is something that we should look much more into and see how we can actually meet the needs of the industry instead, because then we would be much more relevant for what we're doing. I usually take a few anecdotal examples also because I think they spur some interest into what people actually do to change things. And I think that this, which comes from the company my wife is working at, it's my wife in the middle of the picture there, looking into how can you secure talent within an IT industry. And She got a job in this industry saying that we need to hire 400 programmers. Can you help us doing that? And then the boss came back a week later saying that are you ready soon? Because we need them now. And she said, well, hiring 400 people, it would take me almost a year to interview the people for that. So this just doesn't work. So they decided to restructure their recruitment process. What they did that I thought was quite fascinating was that they translated the requirement specification for IT jobs into a game. An interactive game where potential candidates could go in and level in this game, and they could start the hiring process with those that came out best in that process. And interestingly enough, those that came out best, many of them didn't have their degree. They hadn't finished their university. There were actually even people who hadn't gone to university at all, but that met the requirements in this sense. Also, interestingly enough, the IT sector in Sweden or in many parts of the world is like 90% male, 10% female. But with this game, they almost came to a 50-50 on male and female achievements in this sector. So what does this tell me? Well, it tells me that as a university, we're not educating people to get skills. We're educating people to get a degree. And I think that we really need to change our attitude towards how we're doing these things. And if we want to educate people to sort of meet the needs in the industry, I think we have a fascinating example of which I believe several people in the room have been involved as well. At KTH, we created, with support from the Wallenberg Foundation, the Software Development Academy, which role was to educate newly arrived immigrants to get more or less like a bachelor degree level of knowledge in a 12 to 14 weeks program in this sense. And it became extremely popular. It worked well. It was running for, I believe it was 11 seasons before it needed to be terminated in a sense. But here you meet with a group of people who have been unemployed simply because of their origin or their lack of documentation of their skills. But by simply sort of quickly move people up the knowledge level and give them an opportunity also to work with talent acquisition people to be able to find their way out, you could actually meet these kind of things in a different way. I finally want to say a few things. I have to say a few things in relation to the what's happening the last few years, the pandemic. As one of my colleagues said, but he doesn't want to be quoted, so therefore his quote is not on the slide. He said, if I knew that a pandemic what was required for the university to start digitalizing, I would have started it a long time ago. Of course, that's very rude towards everybody that have lost their dear ones or have suffered from this pandemic. But it's interesting to see how we've actually managed to change quickly due to this pandemic. At our university, there was a decision made a Thursday night that from Monday morning, a few days later, all our education should be digital. We should move everything into that scene. And it worked beyond my wildest imagination well to do that. Of course, there were a lot of people struggling quite a lot. There was challenges when it comes to digital assessment and so forth, but it worked because we were forced to it. So never waste a good crisis in that sense. And other things that happened that I think was quite interesting was the structure of meetings that kept changing. I mean, every meeting moved online and became fully digital. And that was really an interesting approach forward, because a lot of change happened to meetings. For me personally, I could divide my meeting life into three equally big thirds, of which 1/3 was meetings that completely went into Zoom. And many meetings then actually were significantly shortened, because we can't have a full day meeting on this. If we're meeting digitally, we should meet only for 3 hours or so. Another third was meetings where we said the physical meeting is required for this to happen. So therefore, we're going to postpone it until after the pandemic. Well, that worked in the beginning, but then when people showed that this isn't going to be over by April, as Trump said, it's going to last a lot. I mean, April 2020. It's going to last a lot longer, so we needed to change that. The final third is even more interesting. That was meetings that was just cancelled. And you would think about, what does that actually mean when it comes to changing these kind of things? So I actually then started working in a different fashion. You were sitting at home, you needed to make good use of whatever you were working with at home. And I'm going to skip a few slides here. And one interesting thing that we did was looking into movement, that it's actually important to move. And one of my previous PhD students, Helena Tobiasson, did a PhD thesis where she actually could measure that you actually make better decision and you're much more productive if you can physically move at the same time. She measured that through experiments using these kind of walking belts and treadmills and bicycles and so forth on this. But these became quite popular. So still today, people use these at the office, but that was not the intention. The intention was rather to show that movement is important and that we should support movements more. And Ole Belter is in the room and has practiced moving lectures to quite some extent. And I'm sure that he can talk more about that to share that. But what I did was I got this thing. I started participating in all of these meetings that I was doing and having my mobile phone with me, carrying it like this, walking around, walking 20,000 steps every day, which was really interesting. And now we can even see in Sweden where there's public authorities that says that we actually propose that you should have more walking meetings. You should put it in the agenda that this meeting is a suitable meeting for a walking meeting, clarify it in the announcement, point somebody in charge that can't be walking, that takes notes and controls things, but that the other people can walk around. And the mere fact that it's the Swedish Work Environment Authority also that does this and shows that it works is kind of fascinating. There's limits to these meetings, of course, and one of the things we think we're missing, and clearly at this conference which is missing, is this informal chit chat with the other speakers that are here. I kind of found this an interesting example that I found at a company in Canada that I was visiting once, where they basically put iPads on sedgeways, and whenever you arrived physically to a meeting, this would meet you by the coffee machine and walk up to you and talk about things on a personal note on things. And then they could move into the meeting room and they could turn their iPad towards those that were talking and so forth. Basically a simple solution, but showing that there are creative ideas also to change the way that we're working on things. And I think that this could also be a suitable way for learning in many different aspects. We've clearly shown an increased productivity over this time. There's actually measures on the number of submissions to scientific conferences that has increased. The conference I used to be in charge of had 50% more submissions during the pandemic than before, simply because I believe that people have now more time to dedicate to writing papers because they skip a lot of other things. But as the pandemic went by, something other happened, and that was this change that meant that we had more and more meetings, and all of a sudden the calendar became completely full of things, and how can we do and deliver that? And at one point I was actually called to 2 meetings at the same time, and I then said that, okay, I have 2 ears. Why not participate in both meetings? I announced to both meetings that I would be there for both meetings, and it actually worked tremendously well. despite all of the research saying that you can't divide your attention in this way. I participated in both meetings. Both meetings actually said that they thought I was a very active participant. I stopped my video in one meeting when I was speaking in the other to avoid confusion and so forth. I could even take info from one meeting to the other, so it became very efficient. But now, I'm not saying this to make you go to more meetings at the same time, but rather question, are we having the right meetings? Is a meeting really well structured if it's really possible to participate in more than one meetings? Maybe we actually should revise and rework the way that we look into and work with meetings in that sense. Finally, if my slides want to move forward, I have something that I call the new normal nowadays when I talk about these things. But because what happened during the pandemic was that we went from physical meetings to digital meetings, fully digital meetings. And one of the reasons it worked well, I believe, was that everybody was digitally present. There was an equality in the room that you could have. What is happening now that we sort of slowly turning back to work is that we're going to see much more of hybrid meetings. At KTH, we're building teaching classrooms to support hybrid teaching, and it's going to be very interesting to see the results of that type of work, because this is what I think we will see much more of in the future, that half of the participants will be online and the other half will be in the room, and then we need to create an environment that makes it equitable to participate through these media. And we need to become much more familiar with all of these tools that we can work with to support and document and structure and be creative in these meetings that we do. The slide says meetings, but this could of course say teaching. I mean, from physical teaching to digital teaching to hybrid teaching. That's the way things are going to change in the future. So in summary, I think that there's a few important takeaways that I wanted to share here, looking into this new normal in this sense. And this is that digital transformation is important. It is happening. It's actually changing the business rather than changing the technology. And we should acknowledge that. We should have sustainability as a driver in this, because we've created a much better world by traveling less and still become able to have a social interaction with peers in that sense. We need to question old habits. It took the pandemic for this actually to happen, but we need to be more prone to actually investigate and study how we change things in the future. In Sweden, we have something called systematic work environment assessment, which is that we follow up the work environment in a systematic fashion with the employers and the unions working together on this. But typically they work with the physical or maybe psychosocial work environment. But I think we need to focus much more on the digital work environment. And I have lots of examples on where we've done such things as well. We need to invest in the change. Hybrid is default, as I talked about. We need to build trust on each other, not question whether people actually are delivering or doing what they can, because I think that this pandemic has shown that people have taken great responsibility to deliver what they're doing. And I think we need to educate ourselves all the time. My hypothesis is that people in the future, or people even now, should spend 10 to 20% of their working time for developing their skills throughout their life. That is needed for the future. So that was what I had wanted to share with you. Thanks a lot. And if there's any questions, I'm open to that. Yes, I had 2 quotes in the end that I just wanted to share as well. Speaking of change, I was speaking to the rectors of the universities in Sweden, and I got this quote from Uppsala University, the oldest Nordic university, saying that Uppsala University has had the same business model for 500 years. It's going to last for another 500 years. No. That's not how things are going to change. The business model is changing now, and we should be ready for it. And as our previous university chancellor said, to reorganizing a university is like moving around on a graveyard. You shouldn't expect to get too much help from those immediately involved. With that, I leave it to questions.